You. Hello again. Apparently I wasn't speaking fast enough, I was told. People had difficulty because I was speaking so slowly. And so I think I'll speed up a bit and speak at a normal pace rather than slowing down for you. No, that was a joke. I won't really do that. I will try and speak slowly, but I'm not very good at speaking slowly, as you know. So the second part of my talk about the police is linked to two major incidents that occurred in UK society in the 70s and early 80s, and which in fact led to precipitating my decision to leave the police after 10 years, which of course was a prelude to my becoming an interpreter. So I suppose it was a good thing. One door closes, another opens. You know, I was talking about the fact that the law is binary, guilty or innocent, black or white, and people are not. People are shades of grey. Of all the murderers I met in my time, I must have met about 200 murderers probably that I know about. Most of them were not bad people. Most of them were just people who got in a situation where they couldn't control themselves anymore. Things got out of hand. Often, push came to shove, as they say in English, literally, and someone died, and someone could not have died. It was just bad luck and poor self-control and people being overtaken by events. Some people are bad, some people are evil, some people take pleasure in killing other people. I met those too, but that's hardly ever the case. And so it's a bit sad that the law can't really take into account all the extenuating circumstances which people always have. I forgot to start my timer. So that means you get an extra minute. So to come back to the theme of my second half of my speech, there were two incidents which were huge upheavals in British society, and both of which involved me on a very tangential way as a policeman, and both of which gave rise to me thinking I don't want to be part of this version of the social contract anymore. The first one was the Greenham Common and RAF Molesworth incidents. Now, Greenham Common, you ought to know, but probably don't because you're too young, is a byword for nuclear disarmament. Greenham Common was a huge American air base in the UK, not far from London, where nuclear missiles were stationed, American nuclear missiles. That was at the time when the UK was very much seen as an aircraft carrier for the USA, enabling the USA to strike Russia, basically, because, of course, Europe is nearer Russia than the US. And so they could use shorter range weapons, which would, in the event of a massive outbreak of warfare, have been used to strike against the Russian heartland from, in this case, the UK. Now, the UK is fairly unique in that, as you, again, may or may not know, after the Second World War, there were many, many, many airfields which exist in the UK. Most of them are now disused. They're used as racetracks, but in those times, late 70s, early 80s, the Americans were hoping, it was the height of the Cold War, the Americans wanted to counter the Russian threat, and they said, well, we can station some cruise missiles which have a 3,000 kilometre range, I know this, I work at NATO, in the UK, and we can strike at Moscow from there. And so Greenham Common was an airbase, and it was the site of a 10-year-long nuclear disarmament demonstration. It gave rise to the whole phenomenon, which again you won't know anything about because you're too young, of women. Women spelt W-I-M-M-I-N, women. Now these women camped outside the gates to Greenham Common for 10 years. It was a peace camp. It was a time when peace and love and flower power were very much in vogue, and people thought that nuclear weapons were evil, as they probably are. And it was the height of the popularity of CND, which again you may or may not know is the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, with the famous sigil, which I will write on a bit of paper here, the famous CND sigil, which is like that. That's the CND Nuclear Disarmament sigil, which in the UK in those days was a huge deal. It really informed most of society. And the women, I say, were the activists who were in these peace camps. Now, the Americans wanted to station more cruise missiles in the UK. So what they did, they look around and they talked to the UK government under Margaret Thatcher, and they discovered there was another disused RAF base, which was very close to Cambridge, where I was based as a policeman, and it was called RAF Molesworth. RAF Molesworth, as I say, was ideal for stationing cruise missiles because in that part of the UK there isn't a great density of population, which enhances security and means that there'll be fewer people to get upset by the proximity of tactical nuclear warheads. And so they decided to install cruise missiles at Molesworth. It was a long process because the base had to be modernised to meet the standards required by the Americans. Then, of course, they had to ensure the security of the base, which had been disused. So all this took about a couple of years of building work. And then they started to ship the nuclear weapons in using trucks, obviously American trucks, usually in the dead of night to try and avoid the protest of the population. And we, as police, we were there guarding this place for every day, 24/7 for years, in fact. And I was part of that guarding effort, and I was a commanding officer then at a lower level, so I had men under me. And our job was to secure the perimeter of the airbase. I still remember the first arrival of nuclear missiles, cruise missiles. Michael Heseltine, who was the defence minister, who was nicknamed Tarzan because he had this shock of blonde hair, and he came down from a helicopter in camouflage gear, and he rappelled down in front of the gate to obviously immediate opportunity. To him it was a bit of a game, quite frankly. Now, I have no problem necessarily with the government deciding with the Americans to install nuclear missiles. That they have that sovereign right. What I do have a problem with is the police being used not to police the protest, but to prevent protests. Because to me, in a civilised society, people have the right to protest, as long as they don't infringe the law. That surely is a fundamental factor in a democracy. If people don't like nuclear missiles being in their country, if they don't like being a pawn for US foreign policy, they surely have a right to say so, as long as they don't break the law. And what happened was, we would be sent far afield to actually stop the groups of protesters coming up from other parts of the country to RAF Molesworth before they could even get there. And that is fundamentally to infringe on their right to free speech, and the police don't have that right. It's not a legal thing for the police to do. And yet the police had no problem with this, because you have to understand the mentality of policemen. Policemen are fundamentally very conservative people with a small c. Basically, if you're protesting against anything, you're wrong, because you're one of those weird left-wing, pink, communist, liberal protesters who thinks about stuff, and the police aren't paid to think. And so the police are always on the side of the government in power, because they think the government is the right thing, the government is the structure, it's order, it's discipline, that's what we like, we're the police. And so the police are always going to be more zealous in applying those sort of orders than they are in guarding the civil liberties of those people who want to protest and saying, we are here to enable you to protest, which they are as well. And so that was something I didn't like profoundly, and it went on for several months, and we were doing things that were illegal, and I don't think the police should do things that are illegal, quite frankly. And the second incident which led to my leaving the police was involving the miners' strike. Now, you may or may not remember the enormous social upheaval which took place in the late 70s, early 80s in the UK. Basically, Margaret Thatcher, one of her ambitions was to break the power of the unions. Now, to be fair, in those days, the days of Red Robbo was a shop steward who was a communist, and he was a shop steward in one of the British Leyland factories. Again, British Leyland has gone as well. That was the huge car producer in the UK. And they were so bolshy. You may or may not know the word bolshy in English. Bolshy means you're annoying, you're rebellious. I'm sure you know the word bolshy. I hope you do. Oh, that's quite an old word. And they were so bolshy, nothing ever got done. The cars were crap. They were always on strike. You couldn't do anything. And it's true, the unions had huge power in those days. And Margaret Thatcher decided she wanted a showdown with the unions, because the unions were running the country. It wasn't the government. That's true. There was the famous Winter of Discontent, which again is a Shakespearean quote from which play? Richard III, which has become famous. That phrase has entered into the English language, a Winter of Discontent, because there were a lot of strikes and blackouts in the winter of 1981, I think it was. I can't remember which year it was anyway. And this shows that the unions were running the show, not the government. And to be fair, that is probably not necessarily a good thing. So Margaret Thatcher said, I'm going to break the unions. Now, you have to understand also, looking at the social contract side of things, that the prime union in the UK in those times was the National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM. And the NUM was run by Arthur Scargill. Arthur Scargill was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, and he also wanted a showdown with the government. It was basically like High Noon. They were facing off who was going to blink first. And what happened was the miners went on strike. If any of you have seen the film Pride, I think Arnaud has. It's a great film because it's about the miners' strike. It's about the fact that the miners were on strike for 2.5 years, which meant they had no income because the miners' union had some money, and of course their job was to help the people strike by feeding their families when they were on strike and not getting their salaries. But it was an enormous social stress in the country at the time because the mine workers were very numerous in those days, and various people clubbed together to help the miners avail themselves of their right to strike. Because to have a right to strike, you have to be able to feed your family. Otherwise, you have to go back to work with your tail between your legs. And obviously, the government was not going to help them to strike. That was against the government's interest. So the film Pride is very good, actually. It's a very powerful film. It's about a group of gays in London who want to help the miners because they feel that they are in a group which is discriminated against, as are the miners, and they have fellow feeling with the miners. But the average miner doesn't like gay people. At least they didn't in those days. So it was extremely amusing in some ways, and you actually see me in the film. I spotted myself because they show one of the pickets. Anyway, let's come back to what I was saying. So the miners' strike. During this strike, the police were deployed en masse for many years. I had colleagues who actually quadrupled their salary through overtime payments for policing the strike. So the police were very happy because they were getting lots more money. Because they were permanent pickets on most of the big coal mines. And the police were there on one side, the miners on the other side. There was a lot of social unrest, a lot of people were arrested, a lot of violence. Some people even died. And we were what they call the thin blue line, which is the line of police between the miners and the strikers. Because obviously in those days there were black legs. You may not know what a black leg is. A black leg is a strike breaker. And so, of course, if you have a strike breaker, the people who are on strike get very upset, and this leads to violence. That's another of the reasons why the police had to be present. So we were there a lot. We were travelling all around the country, going to the various mines. It was quite scary at times because it used to get pretty violent. I was injured a couple of times. But there weren't many firearms used, because in those days in the UK there weren't many firearms. Our colleague here comes from Manchester, which apparently is the city in the UK with the most amount of gun crime these days. So no, were you ever shot at?
No.
No, he wasn't shot at, but anyway, in those days there were hardly any firearms in the UK, so at least that didn't happen. Anyway, so during all that time, again, we were sent out. The police were very violent in their quelling of the miners' strike. And to be quite frank, again, to me, the police are not there to quell the miners' strike. They're there to police the miners' strike. It isn't their job to mete out punishment to people who haven't done anything proven in a court of law. And again, we were sent all around the country to stop the flying pickets, because the miners organised themselves and sent contingents of miners all around the country to create unrest around the pits. We were sent and to arrest them before they got anywhere near where they were going. And we had no grounds to arrest them. They hadn't done anything wrong yet. And again, that stuck in my craw. It left a nasty taste in my mouth. I don't think the police, again, should be doing that. But the police, because they are a very conservative strain of people, don't mind doing this, because they think that anybody protesting against the established order is per se wrong. It doesn't matter what they're doing, they're wrong because they're protesting. That's the basic premise. And to be fair, again, policemen aren't great people for introspection, so I'm not sure that any of them actually went through this whole thought process and saying, I am against them because they are against the social order, but that's just the way the police react. So it was all going to hell in a handcart, in my opinion. In the end, as you probably know, you must know this, because it's the same with France, the same with Belgium, the government won, the miners lost. Now there are hardly any mines in the UK. That, again, is in line with the way in which the Western world is developing, because we don't produce much anymore in the UK. It's all service industries. And so the miners were broken. So in the showdown between the power of the government and the power of the organised unions as to who would run the country, the government ended up winning, because basically they starved them out, because the miners had to go back to work because they had no food. Voila. So that's the end of my 12 minutes. Thank you for listening.